London, a city of dim gas lamps, wet cobblestone streets, and fog that moves like a living thing, wrapping itself around every roof and alley. If you are hearing this right now, take a moment. What time is it where you are? Is it morning, when mist covers your window, or night, when the world turns quiet? Tell me in the comments, let me know where you're listening from. And if you choose to stay with me through this story, don't forget to subscribe, because that small click keeps stories like this alive through the fog of time. Now, take a deep breath. Can you feel it? The scent of old bricks, of coal smoke, of footsteps hurrying past in the cold. In this city, behind every closed door, someone is hiding a part of themselves they can't speak about. London is a place where light and darkness share the same heartbeat, where every man walks with a shadow he pretends not to see. And among those people is a man named Mr. Utterson, a lawyer, calm, rational, loyal. A man who believes every mystery can be explained by reason or by law, but soon he will discover something neither can protect him from. Our story doesn't begin with a crime. It begins with a feeling, a quiet unease, as if somewhere in this vast city, a door is left slightly open into the night, no matter how many times you thought you locked it. Imagine walking with Utterson now, his cane tapping lightly on the stones, the fog rolling thick around his coat, the sound of his breath mixing with the city's heartbeat. He doesn't know it yet, but every step he takes tonight will bring him closer to a name that London will never forget. A name whispered through the mist, carrying both fear and fascination. Hyde. And as you listen, wherever you are, maybe in your car or lying awake in bed, remember this. Every great city hides a darker twin beneath its streets, and every person, even you and I, carries one inside. Some call it temptation, others call it sin, but tonight, you will hear its story. Stay close. The fog is thick, and the line between man and monster is about to disappear. The night was heavy with fog, the kind that blurs every streetlight and hides the shape of a man until he is only a shadow. Somewhere in the distance, a little girl ran across the street, her laughter cutting through the mist like a silver bell. Then came the sound that silenced everything, a quick thud, a gasp, and the echo of small feet hitting the stones. A man had collided with her, not by accident, but with cold indifference. He did not stop to help. He simply looked down, expressionless, and kept walking. People rushed out from the nearby buildings, shouting, surrounding him, demanding an apology. But the man just stood there, calm and strange, his eyes empty of any emotion. There was something about him that made the crowd uneasy. Not ugliness, not anger, but something wrong in a way no one could name. The little girl was crying softly, clutching her knee, and yet the man did not move to comfort her. Instead, he waited, silent, as if human pain meant nothing to him. Mr. Utterson watched from across the street, frozen. Later, he would say that the man gave him a feeling he could not describe. Something darker than fear, like looking at a person stripped of a soul. His name, they said, was Mr. Hyde. That night, Dr. Jekyll came to settle the matter, offering money to calm the family. He spoke with grace, with warmth, apologizing for the man he claimed to know. But even as he smiled, his hands trembled slightly, as if the name Hyde had touched something deep inside him. The crowd accepted the apology. The girl was taken home, and life in London continued as if nothing had happened. But Mr. Utterson could not shake the image from his mind. Who was this Hyde, and why did Jekyll defend him with such quiet desperation? In the following days, the lawyer walked those same streets again, searching for that small figure. Each time the fog rolled in, he thought he saw him, a quick shadow slipping through the lamplight too fast to follow. Hyde seemed to move like a secret, a whisper among alleys, a part of London's heartbeat that belonged to no one. People said when he passed by they felt sick, like the air itself turned wrong. It was not about what he did, but what he was. Some men carry charm, others power. Hyde carried absence, the kind that makes you question everything good you ever believed about humanity. And as the city went back to its rhythm of carriages and conversations, Utterson began to feel it, that strange pull, the sense that Hyde was not just a man to be found, but a truth waiting to be uncovered, one that might destroy more than he was ready to lose. The next morning London looked calmer, but for Mr. Utterson the city had changed. Every sound seemed sharper, every shadow a little darker. In his hand was a document he had read 100 times, yet it still made his chest tighten. It was the will of his friend, Dr. Henry Jekyll. The paper said that if Jekyll ever disappeared or died suddenly, everything he owned would pass to a man named Edward Hyde. Utterson stared at the name, his mind circling the memory of that cruel face in the fog. He whispered to himself, wondering what kind of friendship could bind a man like Jekyll to someone like Hyde. That night Utterson sat alone in his study. The fireplace flickered, throwing soft orange light on shelves full of law books. The smell of old paper and rain filled the room. He thought about Jekyll, the man he had known for years, generous, brilliant, kind. A man who hosted dinners filled with laughter, who spoke of helping others and finding peace in science. And yet, lately, there had been something different in his eyes. A quiet unrest, a secret weight he carried but never spoke of. Utterson remembered how Jekyll once said that every man has two sides, one that society accepts and one that he hides from the world. At the time, Utterson thought it was only philosophy, the kind of talk that floats away with wine and laughter. But now those words echoed with new meaning. Could it be that Hyde was not a friend, but something Jekyll had created? The thought chilled him. He took a deep breath, trying to reason it away, telling himself that friendship sometimes binds us to people we do not fully understand. But the heart knows what the mind denies. Jekyll was hiding something. The next day, Utterson visited him. Jekyll greeted him with a tired smile, his face pale but his manners perfectly calm. They spoke about small things, the weather, the theater, the changing season. Yet beneath every word there was silence, heavy and unspoken. When Utterson mentioned Hyde, Jekyll's hand froze mid-air. For a moment his eyes darkened, then he looked away and said softly, almost pleadingly, that Hyde had gone and would never return. Utterson wanted to believe him. He wanted his friend back, the man he knew before secrets took root in his life. But as he left the house, he looked up at the windows of the laboratory and saw the faint light still burning inside. It was the kind of light that does not chase darkness away, but invites it to stay a little longer. It was a cold night in London, the kind that makes the air taste like metal. The streets were nearly empty, only the echo of a cane tapping on stone and the distant roll of carriage wheels. A man in a fine coat walked slowly under the gaslight, his breath turning into small clouds. He looked peaceful, unaware that he was being followed. From the mist behind him came another figure, shorter, faster, walking with a strange rhythm, as if his steps carried anger instead of weight. The witness later said there was nothing unusual about him at first, until he came close. Then she felt it, that strange chill that freezes the back of your neck when something is deeply wrong. The two men spoke briefly. No one could hear their words, only the tone, sharp, impatient. And then it happened. The sound of a heavy blow, a sudden cry, the violent rhythm of a man losing control. Mr. Hyde lifted a cane and struck again and again until the body collapsed on the pavement. The woman watching from her window screamed, but the city was too used to screams. Hyde looked down at what he had done, breathing hard. There was no fear in his eyes, only satisfaction, as if he had finally fed something that had been starving inside him. He turned, walking away, vanishing into the fog that seemed to open and swallow him whole. By morning, the news had spread. A respected member of Parliament was dead. The only clue was the broken half of a cane found near the body. A cane that once belonged to Dr. Henry Jekyll. Mr. Utterson stood in disbelief when the inspector brought it to him. The smooth wood, engraved with his friend's initials, felt heavier than it should. Together they went to Jekyll's house. The laboratory smelled of chemicals and loneliness. Bottles lined the shelves like silent witnesses. Jekyll looked pale, almost transparent. He said Hyde was gone forever, that justice had already been served. But Utterson saw something behind his words, a tremor, a fear that lived not outside his friend but inside him. As the night returned, London once again disappeared under its veil of fog. Somewhere out there, evil had a face, and Utterson could not stop seeing it in everyone he passed. It was the moment he realized that monsters don't always live in shadows. Sometimes they borrow the faces of men we love. Days passed, but for Dr. Henry Jekyll, time no longer moved the same. His house was quiet now, too quiet. The laughter that once filled his dining room had vanished, replaced by the steady ticking of a clock that seemed to judge him with every second. He sat by the window watching the fog curl through the garden, and in that silence he began to understand what guilt truly sounded like. It wasn't loud, it whispered, it waited. Jekyll wrote letters he never sent, apologies that no one would ever read, to his friends, to God, to himself. He told them that Hyde was gone, that he had destroyed the keys, the formulas, the temptation. But deep down, he knew the truth. Hyde wasn't gone. He was sleeping, somewhere inside, waiting for the smallest crack to crawl through. Utterson came to visit one afternoon. The lawyer's voice was warm, careful, almost pleading. He spoke of faith, of forgiveness, of redemption. Jekyll smiled politely, said all the right things, but his eyes betrayed him. They were the eyes of a man who no longer believed in light. After Utterson left, Jekyll looked into the mirror. For a long moment he couldn't tell if the man staring back was himself or someone else. The lines on his face looked sharper, the shadows deeper. He thought about how it all began, not with evil, but with curiosity. He wanted to understand why men sin, why goodness feels so fragile, why temptation burns brighter than virtue. But what began as science became addiction, and what he tried to control had begun to control him. That night Jekyll walked through his laboratory, running his hand along the glass bottles, the notes, the stains of old experiments. He whispered to himself that he had only wanted to help mankind, to free the soul from suffering. But the truth hurt more than any confession. He hadn't been trying to save mankind. He had been trying to save himself. As the candles flickered low, Jekyll placed his hand on the window pane. Outside, London slept beneath its fog. Innocent, unaware. He envied them. The people who could close their eyes without fear of what waited on the other side of their dreams. Night fell again, and the house of Dr. Jekyll glowed faintly behind its drawn curtains. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of chemicals and something else, something human, like fear trying to hide under the scent of metal and dust. The laboratory looked like a battlefield of glass and ink, bottles half full, papers scattered, candlelight trembling across the desk. Dr. Jekyll stood before his table, his sleeves rolled up, eyes sunken from sleepless nights. His hands trembled as he poured the final drop of liquid into a beaker. The mixture hissed and turned a deep shade of crimson. He had promised himself he would stop. He had sworn that Hyde was gone. But temptation, he realized, doesn't knock twice. It waits, and the longer it waits, the louder it becomes. Jekyll stared at the beaker as if it were alive. He could feel the heat rising from it, smell the sharpness that burned the back of his throat. A voice inside whispered that he had already lost everything, that one more taste would not matter. The mind argued, but the heart had already decided. Slowly, he lifted the glass. His reflection shimmered in the red liquid, half human, half shadow. He whispered a prayer that sounded more like a confession, and drank. The change came fast. His body twisted, bones creaked, the world tilted. His breath turned into something wild, uncontrolled. And then there was silence. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer Henry Jekyll. The world felt sharper, the air sweeter, his body smaller but filled with raw energy. Hyde smiled. It was the kind of smile that comes from freedom without consequence. He ran his hands through his hair, laughing softly, a laugh that didn't belong to any sane man. In that moment, London outside seemed to pulse with life. The city lights were calling him. The night wanted him back. Hyde slipped out through the back door, his footsteps quiet but hungry. Behind him, the laboratory remained lit, still breathing with the warmth of what had just happened. When morning came, Jekyll woke up on the floor, his clothes torn, his hands dirty. He couldn't remember everything Hyde had done, only the taste of it, the dangerous sweetness that came with losing control. As the sunlight crept through the window, Jekyll pressed his palms against his face and whispered the words he no longer believed. Never again. But somewhere deep inside, he already knew that the laboratory had become his church, and temptation was now his God. There is a kind of hunger that lives in every human heart, quiet but endless. For Dr. Jekyll, that hunger had taken shape. It had a name, a face, and a voice that whispered to him even in daylight. He tried to resist, to bury the memory of what it felt like to be Edward Hyde, but every attempt made the craving stronger. At first, the transformation had been about science, a bold experiment to separate good from evil. But now, it had become something darker, something almost holy in its own twisted way. He missed the freedom, the release, the wild energy that came with letting go of rules. When he was Hyde, there was no guilt, no expectation, no judgment. The world was his playground, and he could move through it like a shadow untouchable by shame. Days turned into weeks, and Jekyll began to feel the symptoms of withdrawal. His hands would shake when he saw the locked cabinet where the potion used to be. His heart would race when he smelled the chemicals in the air. He told himself he would stop, that he could stop, but sin is a clever liar. It does not take from you all at once. It gives first, sweetly, making you believe you are still in control. One evening he found himself pacing the lab again, whispering that it was just for study, just one last test. But what he really meant was one last escape. As the red liquid touched his lips, a wave of warmth ran through him, followed by the familiar pull of transformation. His body shrank, his mind sharpened, and Hyde was alive again. The streets of London welcomed him like an old friend. Hyde wandered through alleys, laughing softly to himself, tasting the thrill of danger. He pushed people who got in his way, stole what he pleased, mocked the weak, and pitied no one. It wasn't about cruelty anymore. It was about feeling something in a world that had gone numb. Back in the daylight, Jekyll would wake up exhausted, covered in the dirt and shame of Hyde's actions. He began writing in his journal, trying to confess to himself. "I am losing the line between us," he wrote. "I am beginning to forget who I am when I wake." Still, at night, he felt the pull again. The desire to dissolve, to disappear into the part of himself that feared nothing. Addiction, he realized, was not about the act. It was about the absence, the emptiness that waited when the thrill was gone. Every man carries a door inside him, a door he swears he will never open again. But when the night is long enough, when the loneliness gets loud enough, he always finds the key. Jekyll kept his key close, and each time he promised to throw it away, his hand only gripped it tighter. Dr. Lanyon had always believed that science should serve the soul, not play God with it. He was a man of reason, proud of his calm, his order, his faith in logic. But the night he received that letter from Henry Jekyll, everything he believed began to crumble. The letter was urgent, desperate, almost trembling in its words. It asked him to come at once, to retrieve a small drawer from Jekyll's laboratory, and to wait for a man who would explain everything. Lanyon hesitated. The city outside was already covered in fog, but something in those words felt heavier than fear. Against his better judgment, he obeyed. When he entered Jekyll's laboratory, the air was thick, almost alive. He found the drawer exactly where it was described. Inside were bottles, powders, and a small notebook filled with formulas that looked more like prayers than science. He locked the door, sat by the fire, and waited. The hours stretched. Then came a knock. A man entered, small, nervous, moving like a creature who didn't belong in daylight. His clothes were neat, but his hands shook as he spoke. "You have what I came for," he said. His voice was thin, sharp, and unsettling. Lanyon handed him the drawer, studying the stranger's face. Something about him made his skin crawl, not for what he did, but for what he was. The man poured the mixture into a glass. The liquid turned a violent shade of purple, shimmering under the firelight. He looked at Lanyon and smiled. "You are a man of science," he whispered. "Will you watch what science cannot explain?" Lanyon wanted to leave, to refuse. but curiosity held him like a hand around his throat. The man drank. The transformation was not like anything he had ever imagined. His bones twisted, his spine cracked, his skin shifted color as if it were made of smoke and memory. When the convulsions stopped, the small man was gone. In his place stood Dr. Henry Jekyll, pale and shaking, tears in his eyes. Lanyon couldn't speak. His mind refused what his eyes had seen. Jekyll knelt, whispering apologies, explaining the experiment, his desire to separate good from evil. But Lanyon heard nothing. All he could see was the impossible truth before him. Science had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. That night, Lanyon's world collapsed. The fire burned low, but he could not feel its warmth. He realized that the darkness Jekyll had unleashed was not just inside one man, but inside them all. When Jekyll left, Lanyon sat alone until morning, staring at his hands as if they no longer belonged to him. In his journal he wrote one final line before his health began to fade. "I have seen the soul of man, and it was not meant to be seen." The first time it happened without the potion, Jekyll knew he was no longer in control. He had been sitting by the fire, reading quietly, when his hands began to tremble. At first, he thought it was exhaustion, another sleepless night catching up to him. But then came the heat in his chest, the twisting in his bones, the cracking of something deep within. He stumbled to the mirror and watched in horror as his reflection shifted. The calm, gentle features of Dr. Jekyll melted away, replaced by the cruel grin of Edward Hyde. No potion, no science, just the will of the monster, finally strong enough to rise on its own. Hyde laughed softly, touching his face as if reuniting with an old friend. Freedom. It rolled off his tongue like a prayer. For Jekyll, it was a nightmare. For Hyde, it was rebirth. He left the house that night, disappearing into the fog-drenched streets of London. Every step he took left the echo of Jekyll's despair behind him. He no longer needed formulas or bottles. The transformation now obeyed his desire, his rage, his hunger. The line between the two men had vanished. Hyde was no longer the creation. He was the master. Days blurred together. When Jekyll awoke, he would find his clothes torn, his hands bruised, and the faint metallic smell of blood on his cuffs. He stopped writing in his journal because the words no longer belonged to him. Sometimes, while looking into the mirror, he would see Hyde's shadow moving a heartbeat too slow, as if mocking him from inside the glass. The servants began to whisper. They said Dr. Jekyll had fallen ill, that he rarely left his room, that the voice behind the door no longer sounded like him. In truth, he was becoming a prisoner in his own body. Hyde used his strength, his speed, his cruel delight to walk the world freely, while Jekyll watched helplessly from within, screaming into silence. One morning Jekyll tried to pray, but the words caught in his throat. The voice that answered was not his. It was Hyde's, smooth and calm. "You wanted to see what freedom looks like," he whispered. "Now you do." And the worst part was that Jekyll understood. Hyde was not a stranger anymore. He was the part of himself that no longer needed permission to exist. The house on Cavendish Square looked ordinary from the front, elegant even, with polished windows and a bright brass knocker that caught the morning sun. Neighbors often passed by and spoke kindly of Dr. Jekyll, the generous man who once hosted warm dinners and laughed with his guests until the candles melted to stubs. But around the corner, hidden from the main street, There was another entrance, a small, worn wooden door, scarred by weather and time. It led to the back laboratory, the place where no visitor was ever welcome. 2 doors, 2 worlds, connected by one man who was no longer whole. At night, when the fog thickened, the contrast between them became unbearable. One door glowed with soft light, a symbol of civility and order. The other remained in darkness, a passage for the creature who came and went unseen. It was as if London itself reflected the war inside Jekyll, a city that looked proper on the surface, but hid 1,000 sins in its alleys. People often think evil announces itself loudly, with noise and chaos. But here it had learned to whisper, to live quietly behind the same walls where kindness once lived. Jekyll would sometimes stand between the 2 doors, staring at them as if they could answer his questions. He used to believe he could keep them separate, that Hyde could remain behind one while he lived in peace behind the other. But the truth was clear now. Both doors opened to the same darkness. The servants avoided that side of the house. They said the air there felt heavier, the temperature colder, like a place that refused sunlight. At night, strange noises echoed from behind the laboratory wall. The sound of glass breaking or laughter that didn't sound human. Utterson, passing by one evening, looked at the 2 doors and felt an ache in his chest. He realized that Jekyll's home was no longer a house. It was a confession carved in brick. One door for the man the world adored, the other for the man he tried to hide. And between them, a soul pacing endlessly, searching for a way out that no longer existed. Somewhere deep inside that house, the walls remembered every scream, every prayer, every promise Jekyll made to himself, and broke again. It was no longer just a building. It had become the body of a man divided in 2. It was a cold Sunday evening when the servants finally gathered the courage to knock on Dr. Jekyll's door. For days, they had heard strange sounds coming from the laboratory, the dragging of furniture, a man's voice muttering in tones that shifted from sorrow to rage. But that night, it was different. The voice behind the door no longer sounded like their master. It was thinner, raspier, as if something human had been stretched too far. Mr. Poole, Jekyll's loyal servant, felt his hand shake as he called out. There was no answer, only the soft scrape of movement from within. He turned to Mr. Utterson, who had arrived after receiving Poole's desperate note. The lawyer's face was pale, his voice steady but low. "We break the door," he said. The moment the wood splintered, a smell of chemicals and dust spilled into the hall. The room was dim, the air thick, the fire burned out. On the floor lay a small figure, twisted, lifeless. Hyde, his face frozen in terror, as if death had caught him mid-scream. But there was no sign of Jekyll. Utterson searched the room, calling his friend's name, hoping for any sign that the man he knew was still alive. But the truth came slowly, painfully. Jekyll was gone. The man they saw on the floor was both of them, 2 souls sharing one end. Utterson looked around at the scattered papers, the broken glass, the shattered mirror. In its cracked surface, he saw his own reflection multiplied, each version of himself staring back with quiet horror. The world outside carried on, unaware that inside this grand house, a man had lost his final battle with himself. As Poole covered the body, Utterson stood in silence. He felt grief, but more than that, he felt recognition. Because somewhere deep down, every man fears that same truth. That one day, the soul will run out of places to hide. And when that day comes, no prayer, no science, no will can offer shelter from what waits inside. The letter was found on the desk beside an empty glass, and a flickering candle burned almost to the end. The paper trembled as if it still carried the weight of the man who wrote it. It began simply with the words, "My dear friend, by the time you read this, I will no longer exist." It was Dr. Jekyll's final confession, written not for forgiveness, but for understanding. His handwriting wavered, uneven, like the voice of someone trying to steady himself while standing at the edge of the abyss. He wrote about the beginning, about curiosity disguised as goodness. He had wanted to help the world, to free mankind from the burden of guilt, to separate the sinner from the saint. But as the ink bled across the page, the truth came out. He had never been trying to save the world. He had been trying to save himself. He wrote of the first time he drank the potion, the moment his blood felt alive, his heart racing with freedom. He called it the birth of temptation. At first it felt like grace, like being unshackled from every judgment that had ever held him back. But soon that freedom turned hollow. The more he gave in to Hyde, the less human he became. He described the taste of it, that dangerous sweetness of sin, how it made him feel untouchable, invincible, almost divine. Yet every time he changed back, he felt smaller, emptier, as if pieces of his soul had been burned away. He confessed that Hyde was not just a creation, but the truth he had tried to hide from the world. Hyde was the hunger, the anger, the pride he had polished away for years. The potion didn't make him evil. It only stripped away his excuses. In the quiet of his laboratory, Jekyll admitted his greatest fear was not death, but becoming Hyde forever. He wrote that the monster no longer needed him, that their bodies were merging, their boundaries gone. He described how he would look in the mirror and see Hyde smiling before the transformation even began. He felt trapped in a body that no longer obeyed him, haunted by the laughter of the creature that carried his own name. Toward the end, the words turned softer, almost tender. He said he pitied Hyde, pitied the part of himself that had never learned to love or be loved. He wrote that perhaps every man carries his own Hyde, and what we call morality is only the strength to keep him locked away. The final line read, "I am both the murderer and the victim, the prayer and the sin, and I no longer know which one deserves mercy." The ink faded into silence, the candle burned out, and the night reclaimed the room. By morning, London would wake to another gray dawn, never knowing that somewhere in its heart a man had written the truth about all of us. That the fight between good and evil is not in heaven or hell. It is right here, beneath the skin. Morning came softly to London, wrapping the city in a pale gray light that could not warm the streets. The fog was thinner now, but it still lingered, like a ghost that refused to leave. Inside Jekyll's house, everything was still. The fire had gone out, the air smelled of dust and old books, and the man who once filled these rooms with laughter was gone. Mr. Utterson stood by the window, holding Jekyll's final letter in his trembling hands. The words echoed in his mind long after he finished reading. He felt sorrow, but also something deeper, a quiet fear. Because Jekyll's story was not only his own, it was every man's story, the war between who we are and who we pretend to be. Outside, the city was waking up. Carriages rolled down the cobblestones, merchants called out, children chased each other through the streets. Life continued as it always does, indifferent to the tragedies that happen behind closed doors. But Utterson could not forget. He looked up at the two windows of the house, one bright, one dark, and he understood what they meant now. They were not just part of a building. They were symbols of the human heart, forever divided between light and shadow. In the end, Jekyll and Hyde were not two men, but two halves of the same truth. One that tried to live for others, and one that wanted to live for himself. Utterson wondered how many others walked these same streets carrying their own secret battle. How many smiled politely while hiding a storm within. He thought about his own life, about the small lies people tell to survive, the masks they wear to be loved, and he felt a chill that no fire could chase away. He realized that Jekyll's tragedy was not in losing control, but in believing he could ever separate himself from the darkness that made him human. We are all made of contradictions, he thought. The difference is only that Jekyll had the courage to face his. The sky outside began to brighten, the sun pushing gently through the mist. Utterson placed the letter back on the desk and whispered a small prayer, not for forgiveness, but for peace. Somewhere beyond the fog, beyond the reach of science and sin, two souls had finally become one. Whether it was salvation or punishment, he did not know. But perhaps that was the point. The judgment of a man does not come from heaven above, but from the moment he looks into his own reflection and decides which face to keep.